The air in the grand conclave of the Galactic Concordance hummed with 1,000 different life support systems. A dissonant chorus of atmospheric processors, gravity generators, and subtle psychic dampeners. It was a space designed for the impossible, the peaceful coexistence of beings from across a quarter of the galaxy. On floating daises of polished obsidian, each calibrated to a specific world's environment, sat the delegates. There were the Cathar, a species of apex predators from a high-gravity death world. Their leader, High-Claw Xyloc, rested on his powerful quadrupedal limbs, his multifaceted eyes scanning the chamber, his chitinous armor the color of dried blood. His submandibles clicked with impatience, a sound like cracking stone that set the delegates from the Glypton hegemony to trembling. The Glyptons, represented by the frail, luminous form of Elder Shale, were a species of sentient flora, their bodies a delicate lattice of crystalline cellulose that chimed softly with every movement. They communicated through modulated light pulses and pheromonal shifts, and the Cathar's very presence was a physical assault on their senses, a constant, low-frequency broadcast of predatory intent. Between these two extremes were the others, the silicates of Cygnus X1, whose thoughts moved at a geological pace, the Luminians, beings of pure energy contained in shimmering fields of force, who had brokered the Concordance centuries ago, and the Skitterkin, a hive-minded insectoid race whose representative was merely a temporary nexus of a consciousness millions strong. For 2 standard cycles, they had debated the newcomers. The species called humanity had been discovered by a long-range probe sweeping the Orion Arm. The data they had sent back was a cascade of contradictions that had thrown the Concordance's threat assessment algorithms into chaos. They were a soft-skinned, bipedal species from a Class 12 water world, a veritable Eden that should have produced docile herbivores. Yet, their planetary history was a litany of violence that would make a Cathar broodmother proud. They had systematically eradicated every other apex predator on their world, not through evolutionary competition, but through coordinated, tool-assisted slaughter. They had then turned this ferocity upon themselves in a series of global conflicts that had nearly sterilized their planet multiple times. And then, they had stopped. The probe data from the last 3 centuries showed a different trajectory. They had turned their aggressive ingenuity inward. They had dismantled their own genetic code, eliminating hereditary diseases, increasing their lifespan 3-fold, and most disturbingly, excising the very hormonal responses that governed fear and aggression. They had bioengineered their world back to health, established a unified planetary government, and then reached for the stars with a quiet, unnerving speed. Their broadcasts were not filled with boasts of conquest, but with complex philosophical treatises, with art of breathtaking beauty and sorrow, with mathematical proofs that danced on the edge of cosmic understanding. They were predator and prey, destroyer and creator, all wrapped in one fragile biological package. The Concordance had debated for cycles. The Cathar and their allies argued for a preemptive strike. The Glyptons and the more passive species argued for caution, for observation. The Luminians, ever the diplomats, had proposed this meeting, a formal first contact within the neutral sanctity of the Grand Conclave. Humanity had accepted with an alacrity that was, in itself, unsettling. "They are late," High-Claw Xyloc rumbled, his voice a subvocal vibration that translated through the chamber's universal system as a gravelly bass. "Punctuality is a measure of respect, or a tactic of intimidation." Elder Shale's light form pulsed a soft, anxious azure. "Perhaps their temporal perception differs from the Concordance standard, High-Claw. They are new to these galactic norms." "They have had access to our data streams for over a year," Xyloc countered. "They know our standards. This is a choice." A chime echoed through the vast space, silencing the low hum of conversation. The central portal, a shimmering vortex of contained spacetime, dilated. The Luminians, who served as sergeants at arms, brightened their energy fields in formal welcome. A vessel was coming through. All eyes, multifaceted, compound, and singular, turned to the aperture. The Concordance was accustomed to displays of power. New species typically arrived in warships bristling with armaments, a clear statement of their technological prowess and martial spirit. The ship that emerged was small. It was a simple, unadorned vessel, a sleek teardrop of polished gray metal with no visible weapon ports, no defensive shielding flickering at its hull, no grand insignia. It was a courier ship, a diplomatic shuttle at best. It settled silently onto the central dais, its landing struts extending with a near-silent hiss. A ramp lowered. The air in the conclave grew thick with anticipation. What manner of creature would emerge? A 7-foot-tall super-soldier encased in powered armor, a telepathic mastermind with an oversized cranium. 3 figures walked down the ramp. They were just as the probes had shown. Bipedal, soft-skinned, shockingly fragile. They wore simple, dark blue tunics and trousers devoid of rank or ornamentation. They carried nothing. No data slates, no ceremonial objects, and most unnervingly, no weapons. Not even the small personal sidearms that were customary for diplomatic envoys. The figure in the lead was a female. Her hair was a mix of dark brown and gray, pulled back from a face that was etched with fine lines. Her expression was one of serene neutrality. The 2 figures behind her, a male with pale skin and another with darker skin, mirrored her composure. They stopped at the bottom of the ramp, their posture relaxed, their hands held loosely at their sides. The lead human's voice was clear and steady, perfectly rendered by the translator. "I am Ambassador Evelyn Reed of humanity. We thank the Galactic Concordance for this invitation. We come in peace." The sheer, unadulterated simplicity of it was a shock. Xylok's mandibles ground together. This was not a power play. This was an insult. To arrive before the combined might of the known galaxy so utterly defenseless was a sign of either supreme arrogance or unfathomable foolishness. "You are welcome, Ambassador Reed," a luminary's voice chimed, a pure melodic tone. "We are the Concordance. We have many questions for your people." "And we for you," Reed replied with a small, polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "But first, custom dictates that we present our credentials. Our people have but 2 which we have brought with us. They are all we have ever needed. They are the gaze and the meal." A ripple of confusion passed through the assembly. The Skitterkin representative tilted its multifaceted head, its antennae twitching as it tried to parse this information through the hive mind's logic. The silicates remained impassive, but a low, resonant frequency emanated from their dais, a sign of deep computational processing. The gaze, the meal, these were not terms of diplomacy, they were terms of biology, of the hunt. Xylok leaned forward, his massive form casting a long shadow over the central dais. "Explain these credentials." Ambassador Reed's eyes, a pale, clear blue, met his. "They are best explained through demonstration. The gaze is our offering to the strong. It is an exchange of understanding, a recognition of sovereignty. The meal is our offering to all. It is a binding of community." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the varied forms in the chamber. "We would begin with the gaze. It is our tradition to offer it first to the one who holds the highest martial authority, or the one who represents the greatest physical power in the room. By our reading of your assembly, that would be you, High-Claw Xylok of the Cathar." Xylok felt a surge of primal satisfaction mixed with suspicion. This fragile creature was singling him out. It was a challenge, then. A bizarre, ritualistic challenge. He was the product of 50 million years of unbroken predatory dominance. His ancestors had hunted armored leviathans in the methane seas of Catharia. His gaze could paralyze lesser creatures with pure instinctual terror. He would play this creature's strange game. "I accept this. Gaze," he rumbled, the word tasting alien in his mouth. "There are no rules," Evelyn Reed said, her voice still unnervingly calm. "Save one, we will stand before you and you will look at us. And we will look at you. That is all." She took 2 steps forward, positioning herself directly in the center of the chamber. Her 2 companions remained by the ship, their hands clasped behind their backs, their faces impassive masks. They were observers, witnesses. The Luminians dimmed the conclave's primary lighting, focusing a single, soft beam on the human and the Cathar dais. The hum of 100 life support systems seemed to fade into a tense, expectant silence. Xylok rose to his full, terrifying height, his 8-foot frame dwarfing the small human woman. He took a heavy step forward to the edge of his platform, his claws scraping against the obsidian floor. The scent of his pheromones, a complex cocktail of dominance and aggression, flooded the air. On their dais, the Glyptons shimmered with distress, their forms contracting. This was the moment of truth. The Concordance would now see the true nature of these humans. Faced with a true apex predator, their carefully constructed calm would shatter. The fear response, no matter how deeply suppressed by genetic engineering, would surface. Instinct always won. Xyloc focused his 4 primary eyes on Evelyn Reed. He let his predatory nature bleed into his stare, a projection of power honed over a lifetime of command and conflict. It was a look that promised dismemberment, a swift and brutal end. He saw the way her chest rose and fell with the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. He saw the faint pulse in the soft flesh of her neck. His hunting instincts screamed at him, cataloging every vulnerability, every point of weakness. She was nothing but meat and fragile bone. He waited for her pupils to dilate, for the tremor in her hands, for the sheen of sweat on her brow, for the scent of her fear hormones, the sweetest perfume a predator could know. Nothing. Her blue eyes met his, and they were as calm as a deep, frozen lake. There was no fear in them, but it was not defiance either. Defiance was a form of fear, a reaction to a threat. There was no aggression, no challenge. There was nothing. An utter, absolute stillness. It was a placid emptiness that was more terrifying than any rage he had ever faced. He pushed harder, dredging up the primal archetypes of his race, the collective memory of the hunt. He projected an image of her being torn apart by his claws, of her bones snapping in his jaws. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of death. He was the end of all things small and weak. Evelyn Reed blinked. It was a slow, deliberate motion, a physiological necessity. But in the context of this silent battle, it felt like a dismissal. Her expression did not change. Her heart rate, monitored by the Conclave's passive bioscanners, remained a placid 60 beats per minute. Her galvanic skin response was flat. She was, by every metric the Concordance possessed, completely and utterly calm. It was not bravery. Bravery was the overcoming of fear. This was the absence of fear. It was a biological impossibility. Xyloc felt a prickle of something cold and unfamiliar slide down his spinal column. His own biology was betraying him. His adrenal glands were pumping, preparing his body for a confrontation, but the target of his aggression was giving him no feedback. It was like roaring at a mountain. The echoes of his own fury came back at him, hollow and meaningless. His stare was a weapon that required a victim, a predator's power that was only validated by the terror of its prey. And this human was not prey. The silence stretched. 1 minute, 2. The other delegates watched, rapt. The prey species, like the Glyptons, were frozen in a new kind of terror. They had lived their entire existence in the shadow of the predator's gaze, a fear so fundamental it shaped their architecture, their art, their religion. To see that gaze met with such placid indifference was to see a law of the universe broken. It was as if gravity had suddenly ceased to apply to this one, small creature. The predator species were equally disturbed. They saw in Xyloc's stiffening posture and the slight, involuntary twitch of his mandibles a reflection of their own confusion. This human was not prey, but she was not a predator either. A predator would have met Xyloc's gaze with a challenge, a baring of teeth, a display of rival strength. The human did none of this. She simply was. Xyloc felt his focus begin to waver. The image of the hunt in his mind was fading, replaced by a strange, intrusive thought. He was looking into the eyes of a being that had faced things far more terrifying than him. His raw, physical power, his claws and teeth and fury, were quaint. They were the tools of a planetary bully. He was staring at a creature that had tamed its own son, that had stared into the void of its own self-inflicted extinction, and had not flinched. He was a monster from a nightmare, but he was facing a creature that had woken up from the nightmare, dissected it, and learned its secrets. He saw in her eyes the quiet confidence of a farmer looking at a wolf circling a well-fenced pasture. The wolf might be dangerous, but the farmer owned the land. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't ignoring his threat. She was invalidating it. She was demonstrating in the most silent and profound way possible that the ancient dance of predator and prey, the fundamental power dynamic that had governed the galaxy for eons, did not apply to her. To her people. With a sharp, grating sound, Xyloc broke the gaze. He looked away, his multifaceted eyes focusing on the polished floor of his dais. He lowered his head, a gesture of submission so deep and instinctual he was not even aware of making it. The chamber's silence was now absolute, a ringing void filled with the colossal weight of what had just happened. The strongest, most feared predator in the Concordance had just been defeated. Not by force, not by technology, not by psychic power. He had been defeated by a calm, middle-aged female of a soft-skinned species who had done nothing but look at him. Evelyn Reed's faint smile returned. It seemed to Zylock infinitely more menacing now. "That was the gaze," she said, her voice echoing in the profound stillness. "A recognition of sovereignty. We have seen you, Highclaw Zylock, and we acknowledge you." It was the wording that twisted the knife. She did not say, "We respect you," or "We honor your strength." She said, "We acknowledge you." The way a biologist acknowledges a microbe in a petri dish. The way a god acknowledges a prayer. "And now," she continued, turning to address the entire stunned assembly, "we offer the meal for all of us, a binding of community." The two other humans who had remained motionless by their ship now moved with quiet efficiency. They opened a compartment in the shuttle's hull and brought out a simple, low table and several containers. There were no gleaming cryogenic pods or complex nutrient synthesizers. The containers were plain, made of a material that resembled wood. From one they took a loaf of some kind of baked grain. It was dark and crusty. From another, a simple ceramic pitcher filled with a deep red liquid. And from a third, a small bowl containing coarse white crystals, bread, wine, and salt. The foundational elements of 1,000 ancient cultures on their long-dead Earth. The other species watched, mystified and wary. "Our offering is simple," Ambassador Reed explained, as her companions began to break the bread into pieces. "On our world for millennia, the act of sharing a meal was the highest form of trust. To eat another's food is to place your life in their hands. It is an act that turns strangers into guests and guests into family. It binds predator and prey alike, for at the table all are equal." This statement sent another shockwave through the conclave. Equal, a Cathar and a Glypton equal. It was a biological absurdity, a philosophical heresy. The male human with pale skin, Dr. Aris Thorne, began to approach the daises, carrying a platter of the broken bread. His movements were slow, non-threatening. He offered the first piece to Highclaw Zylock. Zylock stared at the fragment of baked grain. His every instinct screamed at him not to take it. It was a trick, a poison, a symbol of his humiliation. To accept food from this creature, after she had so effortlessly dismantled his authority, was to compound his submission. But to refuse would be a clear act of hostility, an admission of fear. And he, a Highclaw of the Cathar, did not feel fear. He felt something else, something far more complex and unsettling, a profound sense of displacement. He reached out a secondary manipulator, a smaller, more delicate claw used for fine tasks, and took the piece of bread. It was warm to the touch. It smelled faintly sweet and earthy. The other human, Commander Kenji Tanaka, followed with the pitcher and small cups. He poured the red liquid for Zylock, who accepted it with the same grim reluctance. Then they moved on. To the Glyptons. Elder Shale's light form flickered with intense agitation. Their species absorbed nutrients through their root systems from specially prepared soil. Ingesting foreign matter was not only alien, it was potentially lethal. "We cannot ingest this," Shale pulsed, the translator rendering the light show as a worried, fluting voice. "Our biology is not compatible." "We are aware," Evelyn Reed said, her voice gentle. "The binding is not in the consumption but in the acceptance. Touch it, acknowledge the offering, that is enough." Dr. Thorne extended the platter. With a trembling, vine-like tendril, Elder Shale reached out and brushed the piece of bread. A wave of soft, golden light pulsed from the elder, a sign of deep emotional resonance. He had accepted. They continued their circuit around the great chamber. They offered the meal to the silicates, who extended a crystalline probe to touch the bread, analyzing its composition on a molecular level before retracting in silent contemplation. They offered it to the Skitterkin, who took a piece and immediately passed it back through its ranks, 100 mandibles tasting and testing before the data was absorbed into the hive mind. They even offered it to the Luminians, who swirled their energy fields around a cup, their pure forms interacting with the liquid's atomic structure in a way no one could comprehend. Every species, every delegate, predator and prey, organic and inorganic, individual and collective, all were brought into the same simple ritual. When the humans had finished their rounds, they returned to their own table. Evelyn Reed raised her own cup. "We eat this bread as a symbol of the body, the vessel of our existence," she said, her voice now taking on a strangely liturgical cadence. "We drink this wine as a symbol of the spirit, the energy that animates us. We share this salt as a symbol of the earth, the foundation from which we all spring." She ate her piece of bread and drank from her cup. Her companions did the same. And then a strange thing happened. A feeling began to spread through the chamber. It was not a psychic broadcast or a chemical agent. It was something subtler, deeper, a psychological resonance. Xyloc, holding the piece of bread in his claw, found himself looking across the chamber at Elder Shale. For the first time in his life, he did not see a food source. He did not see a weakling, a victim. He saw another being who had just participated in the same bizarre, profound ritual that he had. They had both accepted the offering of the humans. They were, in this one specific context, peers. The thought was deeply, fundamentally disturbing. It felt like a violation of the natural order. His predatory instincts were still there, but they were muted, muffled under a new, uncomfortable layer of shared experience. Elder Shale felt it too. The terror of the Cathar had been a constant background radiation for his entire existence. But now, looking at Highclaw Xyloc, the fear was different. It was less immediate, less primal. The human ritual had inserted a new variable into the ancient equation of their relationship. It had created a space, however small and artificial, where the Cathar was not just a hunter and the Glypton was not just the hunted. They were fellow attendees at the humans' table. This new perspective was not comforting. It was deeply disorienting, like waking up to find the sky had changed color. The hive mind of the Skitterkin, a consciousness that processed reality through pure, unadulterated logic, was struggling. It analyzed the chemical composition of the bread and wine, carbohydrates, simple sugars, ethanol, trace minerals. There was nothing remarkable about them. It analyzed the human's actions, a primitive social bonding ritual common to countless tribal species. Logically, it should have no effect. Yet the data flooding in from its delegate nexus was illogical. The patterns of the chamber, the energy signatures, the pheromonal balances had shifted. The established hierarchies had been blurred. The humans had introduced a piece of aberrant code into the conclave's operating system, and the system was failing to properly integrate it. The meal was a weapon, more insidious and effective than any plasma cannon or kinetic strike. A weapon fired not at the body but at the conceptual framework of a society. It dismantled hierarchies not by force but by a forced, shared intimacy. It did not conquer, it absorbed. When every species had partaken, or at least acknowledged the offering, Ambassador Reed spoke again, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent chamber. "We have shown you our credentials. The gaze which shows that we do not recognize the old fears, and the meal which shows that we can create new bonds. This is the foundation of human diplomacy. We have nothing more to offer today." She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of finality. "We will await your decision on our inclusion into this concordance. We will remain in this system until you summon us again." With that, the three humans walked calmly back up the ramp into their small, gray ship. The ramp closed. The vessel lifted off the dais without a sound, turned, and moved back towards the spatial vortex. It disappeared as quietly and unassumingly as it had arrived. For a long time after it was gone, the grand conclave was silent. The only sound was the faint chiming of the Glyptons, a melody of pure, unadulterated confusion. The delegates looked at each other, not as predator and prey, or as rivals and allies, but as fellow survivors of a deeply unsettling experience. In their claws, their tendrils, their manipulators, many still held the pieces of human bread. They were no longer just food. They were artifacts, evidence. Finally, Highclaw Xyloc spoke, his voice low and heavy, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "What," he rumbled, the word echoing the thoughts of everyone present, "in the name of the unquiet stars was that?" No one had an answer. The luminary who had first welcomed the humans flickered, its form wavering. Their petition is for membership in the Concordance. A vote must be held. A vote, Xylox scoffed, the sound a dry rasp. How do we vote? What are we voting on? To accept them as allies. That woman, that ambassador, she did not come here to ask for our friendship. She did not come here to negotiate terms or trade technologies. He looked down at his own massive claws, the weapons that had defined him, his species, and his place in the galaxy. They suddenly seemed crude, obsolete. She came here to show us what they are, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. They did not bring weapons because they do not need them. Why would they? You do not bring a sword to tame a wild animal. You bring a calm voice, a steady hand, and a piece of food. Elder Shale pulsed a frantic, terrified lavender. They see us as animals, to be domesticated. Worse, Xylox said, the full, horrifying truth dawning on him. She did not look at me the way a farmer looks at a wolf. A farmer still respects the wolf's power to harm. She looked at me, the way we look at our own history, at the fossils of the great predators we vanquished to rise to dominance, as something that was once dangerous but is now a relic, an object of study, a thing to be acknowledged and then placed in a museum. The implications of his words settled over the conclave like a shroud. The humans hadn't come to join their galactic community. They had come to assess it. The gaze was a test of the old power. The meal was the inauguration of a new one. They had walked into the heart of the galaxy's power structure, unarmed and undefended, and had, in the space of an hour, completely rewritten the rules. The Skitterkin representative finally spoke, its translated voice a sterile, emotionless monotone. Query: the human objective is unclear. If they possess such psychological superiority, why petition for membership? Why not simply conquer? It was a luminary that answered, its light pulsing with a slow, somber rhythm. Because they are not conquerors. We have seen their history. They do not wish to rule. They wish to incorporate, to absorb, to expand their definition of humanity to include everything they encounter. A profound chill, deeper than the cold of interstellar space, settled over the delegates. The terrifying, unspoken truth finally coalesced in the center of the room. The humans hadn't asked to join the Concordance. They had invited the Concordance to join them. They had offered the meal, and they had all, in their own way, accepted. The binding had already begun. They had left the chamber not as sovereign species debating the inclusion of a newcomer, but as a disparate and confused collection of entities who had just had their first lesson from their new, quiet, and infinitely patient teachers. Highclaw Xylox looked across at Elder Shale, who still trembled on his dais. The predatory urge was gone, replaced by a strange and hollow sense of shared destiny. They were no longer predator and prey. They were now simply the other animals in the room. And they were all, suddenly, terribly, aware of the quiet gaze of the farmer.